David, in trying to really discern whether there is a God, I like to look to God's characteristics and see if they make sense. And one of the most important ones is that God is ultimately free and
Right.
totally free. But when you think about some of the other characteristics, God is perfect. So if God is perfect, God always has to do the best, whatever the best is. But if God always has to do the best, then how is God free?
Right. Yeah. That's probably the context in which God's freedom is most often brought up. And I don't have a whole lot of wisdom to contribute to that one.
I'm disappointed.
You're just, I am too. You can only think about so many problems. But I am very interested in the question of divine freedom. Uh, if you, I think questions of divine freedom are really not that different. They're just exaggerated versions of questions having to do with human beings. So just as God's perfect goodness may seem to restrict him, leave him with no options, leave it impossible that he might torture this innocent child for fun, the same thing might be true of a good human being. There's a number of things I can do, but can I really bring myself to douse my daughter with lighter fluid and set her on fire? Well, in a way, I have the power to do that. I'm not paralyzed and so forth. But I can't bring myself
But that's
to
an
do that.
extreme example. I mean,
Sure.
I wonder if its effectiveness, if you look at ordinary things, if God chooses to do one thing or another, in some sense, God will know what's best. If I decide to meet one friend or another friend to do something, I mean, I don't know what's best for the good of the world. I'm just trying to muddle through life. But
Right.
God knows everything, so God's going to know what God's own actions are, what's going to be the best.
Right.
So
Right.
God, to be consistent, has to know those things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the idea that God would be less free because he always does the best thing, and of course knows what the best thing is, that presupposes perhaps the idea that freedom requires alternative possibilities. And if you have other reasons for
What's,
doubting that,
what else could freedom be? I mean, that's the definition of freedom.
freedom could be, well, I hope not, because I'm inclined to think that freedom involves more importantly a different condition, what's often called the source condition. To be free, my action must originate from me in an appropriate way. And of course, that might be quite complex to spell out what that is. The source condition and the alternatives condition are both to be found in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And Aristotle seemed to have thought, like virtually everyone since then, that the source condition, that it's my action, I did it, the buck stops here when tracing causality and responsibility. It comes back to me. And the alternatives condition, that I could have done otherwise, stand and fall together. When the one is satisfied, if I'm genuinely the source of my action, then I could have done otherwise. If I could have done otherwise, it must be because I'm the source of my action. And I'm inclined to think, based on the work of Harry Frankfurt and his attack on the principle of alternate possibilities, and my own work on divine foreknowledge, that the alternatives condition is not the fundamental condition.
But I thought you said if you could not have done otherwise, that means you're the source and the two are related together. You're saying you can tease them apart?
I believe you can tease
You
them
can
apart.
tease them apart.
Yes, yes.
So this is the fundamental thing. So there's a possibility that if I am the source of the action,
Right.
but it is impossible for me to have done otherwise, that satisfies your definition of freedom.
Yes, yes. And I think you can have your intuitions pumped the following way by imagining your favorite conditions for free agency being satisfied. So you know what you're doing, you're not acting under hypnosis, Martians haven't planted a chip in your brain and controlling you, and so on. And then add to the picture that an infallible foreknower knew what you were going to do. And that by itself is going to strip off all alternatives from your action.
Sure.
But it's going to leave you the source of your action. It's not going to affect your sourcehood at all.
Right.
In fact, you are the source of God's foreknowledge, right? God foreknew what you were going to do because you're going to do it.
But now we're talking about God.
Right.
So if God foreknows what I can do, God surely can foreknow what God himself would do.
Exactly.
Now that turns in its own circle and seems to lock God in a tighter vice.
Unless you can solve that problem, right? So if you do come to believe that the sourcehood condition is the important one, the central, essential one, and the alternatives condition is not, just by the way, here's how I tend now to think about the relationship between them. Measles, the condition of measles, is not the same thing as the red spots, which are symptoms of the measles. The red spots typically accompany measles. They're a sign that the measles are present, but the underlying condition is something that is hidden. And one way you can get at the difference between these is to imagine, something that's easy to imagine, measles being present without the red spots being present. Perhaps that even happens. And my understanding of the relationship between free agency and alternatives is much like that between the measles and the red spots. In typical conditions, alternatives are going to be available, but free agency, that underlying condition, which is typically accompanied by alternative possibilities, is something different. I think it's more closely associated with genuine sourcehood.
So are you telling me that every action of God, timelessly, eternally, back and forth, forever, is entirely fixed, that it could not have been otherwise, and yet God is still totally free?
I am saying that, surprisingly. And that's not because I'm giving up at all on the notion of freedom. It's because I think as the result of not only of the discussion of Frankfurt counterexamples, as they're called, to the principle of alternate possibilities, a discussion that has taken place entirely outside of philosophy of religion, but also as a result of my own work on the problem of divine foreknowledge, that what's really important to and essential to freedom isn't the availability of alternatives, though typically alternatives are available, but is sourcehood of the right sort, that the agent, the free agent, is the source of the action in an appropriate sense that would have to be worked out.